You're listening to the Grassroots Church podcast. We're a Jesus-centered community in Thunder Bay, Ontario. You can learn how to participate more by going to our website at grassroots.church.
Hi, everyone. I thought I'd open with a joke because it's going to be probably kind of heavy. So what's more intimidating than preaching on a sermon on Theodicy? The fact that it's being recorded. Is, you know, it's one of the hardest questions in Christian faith, and so now I'm recorded for posterity and all time, and people can look back and say, on June 1st, 2025, this is what you said. Anyway, so for those of you who don't know me, my name's Cory. When Steve asked me to preach, I was pretty excited about it because I've been wrestling with this topic personally and professionally for probably a decade or so. My work is in spiritual care. I worked for 7 years as the chaplain at the Salvation Army Homeless Shelter, and I've worked for a few years now at the regional, doing spiritual care there. It's a lot of end-of-life care or people struggling with this sort of stuff. And now I'm starting an internship as a psychotherapist, transitioning into that kind of work. So the funny thing about all of this is that Theodicy is kind of my bread and butter. I get paid to sit with people who are suffering or confused, wrestling with these difficult questions. And as Steve pointed out last week, the role isn't really to provide a lot of answers or to persuade people into understanding suffering in a certain way. My role is more to be present with people. So I don't have all the answers, but at a certain point, I can't just say nothing or stick with I don't know, because if people, it's one thing to be in crisis, but that's not all the work that I do. Some of the work is walking with somebody years after the fact. And so in the crisis, it doesn't really help to give people answers or theological truths or something like that. But there's meaning-making work that we do after crisis. And if we don't do that, we can very easily get stuck in the pain and turn to a place of cynicism. And so that's the challenge of this kind of work is not to deny it, not to let it fester and develop into cynicism or anger, but to be honest with it and to work through it somehow. So while I preach, things might not be totally linear. This is kind of how it works with the topic. So I might jump around, and I hope that everything I say will anchor into some of these main points. So today I'm going to be covering Theodicy as primarily a relational issue, and one reason or a few reasons why we suffer, but as they're tied to love and how God made us as exocentric beings. So we'll get to that. As Steve pointed out, this question of theodicy, or reconciling God's goodness and power with suffering, comes out of a place of pain and the experience of crisis, and it comes up from people sometimes debating the existence of God. So there's two sides to this. There's sort of the immediate existential crisis, this very emotional place, and then there's a philosophical, logical, very heady sort of side to it. And both need to be addressed at some point, but first we need to recognize that our experience informs our reason. What I mean by that is we don't exist purely as logical people. We think what we think because of the life that we've lived, right? At least to a large part. And this functions as a cycle. We call this praxis, action, reflection. If our thoughts on suffering are totally heady, abstracted ideas, they can easily fail to reflect the reality of suffering. And I think that's what happens sometimes when you see these arguments for why we suffer. And it's like, okay, but that doesn't really track at all with how I've experienced life. It can also be a way for us, ironically, to rationalize suffering as a way of escaping from the pain. And I think where we get this is because if I can think it through, people approach God like this too, right? If I can understand it, then maybe I can control it. And if I can control it and understand it, I don't have to submit to it, because submitting to it is terrifying. And again, this is what makes Theodicy really tricky. Last week, Steve gave an overview of Job and showed how Theodicy is more relational than logical. I'm going to pick up where he left off and hopefully integrate some of my psychology training and with the theology training. I want to look at the role of witness and lament in suffering. So we are embodied dialectics and contradictions. What I mean by this is we have two sides. There's two opposing sides that understand the brain or the world very differently. I'm talking about the brain. So we have our left brain is very logical. It tends to see the world around us as objects to be manipulated. And we rely on this to be industrious and organized. Most of our Western world is built on developing our left brain so that we can be good, sensible people. Our right brain is sort of this beautiful thing we were born with that's intuitive. We recognize others. It's our emotional brain. And so these two sides of our brain are kind of working together, kind of not at the same time. They understand the world around us differently. There's some debate on this. Some people say actually this isn't true, but there's different regions, regardless of how you want to understand it. There's different regions of our brain that become activated at different points. Okay, does that make sense? Our different parts of our brain do different things. And so what I want to suggest here is that suffering is kind of a right brain sport that the left brain is trying to play and understand. What I mean by this is that if our primary approach to suffering, or what if our primary approach to suffering isn't a logical answer? It's an emotional and relational one first. So when we have these questions of why would God allow this to happen to me? Or my God, why have you forsaken me? These are not logical questions. These aren't actual questions that people are asking in the moment, right? It's lament. They're questions that rise up from a soul in anguish. In psychology, we have this idea that the right brain responses don't change the left brain's feelings and survival strategies. So what I mean by this is that when we experience trauma, grief, incredible suffering, the left brain shuts down and the right brain is engaged, meaning that when someone is suffering, well-meaning individuals try to give them answers, they can't hear it because the way God made us is that part of our brain is it's offline. So the emotional brain needs to be seen and heard in order to be soothed. So the reason I'm sharing all this is because as Christians, this question of suffering is a big deal. A huge part of what we do, the way that we live our life, is to try to tend to those who suffer, right? Just as Jesus did. And so the Christian response needs to be to draw near, to offer presence, and to be a role of witness. Because the logical, let me give you answers, it just doesn't work. And further, God doesn't actually explain suffering away. He rarely gives us an answer when we suffer, but God enters into suffering with us. And this is the whole point of the incarnation and of our faith. We worship a God who took on flesh and dwelt among us, taking on the very nature of a servant, despised and rejected, who bore our pain. Right? This is John 1, Isaiah 53, Philippians 2. There's mutuality in suffering. And this is an enormous theme through Scripture. I like the line from Henry Nouwen, who said, "The greatest task of the minister is to enter into solidarity with those who suffer." And by minister, he just means those who are Christians. Throughout the prophets, there's also this pattern of reality, grief, and hope. That this is sort of the pattern as you read through the prophets. That they see reality, they give people a space to grieve reality, and then eventually there's this message of hope. And you can't get to hope without first acknowledging reality as it is and grieving it. So it's not, hey, you shouldn't feel this way. Have you thought about this? Like what we saw with the skit, right? The actual response to suffering should be, I see that you hurt. I witness your pain. Tell me about the specifics of your pain. How exactly does it hurt? And to give people a chance in a place of safety to express the particulars of their pain. Because we need to be witnessed in suffering, to be seen in suffering and recognized, because so often we share the same wounds. The particular experience of our pain actually touches the experience of other people's pain, right? We also need to know that we don't suffer alone. I think that's a huge part of that as well. This is just a little fun thing. I thought this was cool. At some point in my life, I tried to learn Hebrew. It was really hard, and I didn't have time, so I gave up. But what do you notice? This is Psalm 13. What do you notice when you look at this? Just on observation. That's right. So it kind of, and I think this is a really cool, visible representation of what happens through lament, right? Lots of times when you start, you've got a troubled and weary heart, and you've got all these things to say. Once you start, right, that you kind of open the floodgates. And the cool thing through Psalm 13, it starts, God, why have you forgotten me? Where are you? You've forsaken me, that sort of idea. And then it ends with, and I will praise you and I will trust you. And this is just pure speculation, but I would imagine that David probably didn't write that in one sitting. I think that comes from a lifetime of writing lament and from understanding this sort of process. And there's gaps too, like if you read Psalm 13, it's like two couplets that kind of, there's this movement. Anyway, I thought that was cool. There's another thing through the Psalms. There's these two movements Old Testament theologians talk about. There's the movement of orientation or reorientation, and there's a movement of disorientation. And basically, Old Testament theologians talk about this as we have these two ways, this language for both of these movements in our life, that there's times of disorientation and times of reorientation. And when we're in a place of stability, we tend to talk to God in thanksgiving. And when we're in a place where things are falling apart, the biblical response is lament. And so what's interesting about this is that like half the Psalms are lament. A huge, huge amount of it is lament, right? And when we think of the Christian life, I think lots of times we stick in thanksgiving, we hang out there more than, for some reason we're kind of averse to going into lament. Like we talk about it maybe every now and again, but in the biblical story, lament is like half the thing. Like it's a huge, huge part of it. There's this book that I'm going to reference a bunch today. It's called Lament for a Son by Nicholas Walterstorff. And he says, there's this line, this part, he says, please don't say it's not really that bad, because it is. Death is awful, demonic. If you think your task as comforter is to tell me that really all things considered it's not so bad, you do not sit with me in my grief, but place yourself off in the distance. Away from me, over there. You are of no help. What I need to hear from you is that you recognize how painful it is. I need to hear from you that you are with me. In my desperation to comfort me, you have to come close. Come sit beside me on my morning bench. Ooh. I've got like 5 quotes from him, and they're all way better than that one. I don't know why that one brought emotion up, but that's okay. So all this to say, there's need in lament. There's need for lament, for witness, and for solidarity in suffering. I think my point of kind of talking about all this is sort of maybe a practical approach, that the Christian response as the body of Christ is lament, witness, and solidarity in suffering. We have this notion in our culture that when we come to this question of suffering, we say, well, if God is so good and powerful, why would he allow this, right? And this thing happens, so God is either not good, or he's not powerful, he's not real, and people conclude most of the time that, well, God doesn't exist. And the biblical idea of lament is to take all of that pain and anger and depression and direct it to God. And this is the only way really to stay in relationship with God while suffering. The other side of this, though, is that we need to reclaim a corporate sense of lament, because when we are individually devastated by grief or loss, when you're in that abyss that takes over, we must be able to give voice of the suffering to those around us who can't do it for themselves. Because when we're in that place, we can't lean on our own strength anymore. It's gone, right? And this is, if you know Scripture, there's the three roles, right? The prophet, priest, and the king. And this is our priestly role that we're called to as believers. This is intercession on behalf of those who are unable to. How are we doing for time? Oh, making good time here. That's good. I was nervous because it's kind of like 2 sermons smushed together, and I didn't want to keep you all day. So I remember this one time I was leading worship at the shelter, because I used to run these little worship services, and we were singing Your Love Never Fails. And there's the refrain of that song is straight out of Romans, or mostly straight out of Romans. You make all things work together for my good. And so I'm leading worship with a bunch of homeless men, and I'm singing, you make all things work together for my good. And these guys are following along, and they're singing that too. And it brought up this really deep tension in me, because the rate of getting your life back together after homelessness is very low. If you don't know that, tragically, it's more likely that they will end up in jail or in the hospital or dead. Is just kind of how it goes for a pretty big portion of the population. And so that's reality. And I'm sitting there, or I'm standing there, strumming away, trying to sing, you make all things work together for my good. And although that scripture I do believe is true, in that moment, it kind of feels cruel, right? It feels wrong. And so, yeah, those scriptures are true, and they drive at the redemptive reality of God's work throughout human history, but in the face of suffering, right there, this complicated mix of victim and perpetrator and all just the mess, like there's such sheer brokenness of it all. It feels so wrong to say there's this biblical truth, and yet it is true. But the context demands words of lament, words of, my God, why have you forsaken me? Darkness is my only companion. Tears are my food, right? These are the words of David. After the suffering, meaning can be made retroactively. And this is why Israel takes a history so often. God instructs them to stop and look back on where they've been and how they got there. And in looking back, we can see that these passages are true and that we can hold on to these promises. Through devastation, redemption can and does often happen. Sometimes we see it, and often we don't. But during the crisis, we need a place to cry out to God in our confusion and pain. We need our emotional right brain to be soothed by the witness of another. So that's kind of mini sermon number 1. Does that make sense? That's sort of a practical approach: lament, witness in suffering. But why do we suffer? This is what we're here for, right? This is where it gets juicy, I think. Why do we suffer? Because we experience this in spiritual care. I'd call it spiritual distress. Sometimes we call it existential crisis. When we think of suffering in a Christian sense, often we see it as a result of sin or the fall. That's certainly at some point in the conversation, sin has to come into it, right? And this is true. This is true to some extent, but I want to talk about this and kind of clarify. So when we talk about sin, often we have this idea of individual sin, that sin is like an accumulation of all the stuff I did wrong. And that Jesus died for me and my particular sins. And this is true, but it's one aspect of sin in the Bible. These are transgressions, ways that we fall short or miss the mark. And when we sin, when we do things that hurt other people, there are consequences, and lots of times that consequences results in suffering. So partly we sin or we suffer because of things that we do, sins we commit. But there's another understanding of sin as a state of brokenness, or this breaking of shalom, that we used to have this harmony with God, and sin disrupts that, right? And it doesn't just disrupt our relationship to God, it disrupts all of creation, right? Paul talks about creation groaning. So there's this sin as a state where everything's kind of wonky, nothing works quite the way it's supposed to be. There's this general sense of frustration or frustrated efforts. So in some ways, suffering can be the result of our own sin, and suffering can be the result of this sort of broken state, this general sin, this fractured harmony. And I think a big mistake that we make sometimes, and that Steve addressed last week, is that all bad things must be a result of your own sin. And Jesus addresses this pretty clearly. In John 9, people come to him with a man who's blind, and they say, "Who sinned that this guy's blind?" And Jesus' response is that he's not blind because somebody sinned, but that Jesus said he's blind so that the works of God may be seen through him. And I think maybe that's even more confusing, to be honest, because then it feels like, oh, this is some sort of cruel trick that God is playing as a magician, and I'm getting cut in half just to be put back together. That seems unfair. C.S. Lewis calls it is this divine vivisector, which is like vivisection is to be cut apart while something is still alive. That's C.S. Lewis in his Place of Grief. That's what he said in his lament. So in Luke 13, Jesus talks about did they suffer because they sinned? No. Did those people die because they were sinful? No. God sends the rain to fall on the just and the unjust, right? On the righteous and the unrighteous. So That's one cause of suffering, our own failings. Another is because sin is a fallen state. And one is maybe because the works of God can be seen through suffering, but what's the deal? There's Jerry Seinfeld. What's the deal? I wanted to look for a moment at Genesis 2. I think this is profound and kind of weird and might throw a wrench in your theology, and if it does, you can fight me after, and that's fine. There's this line, "It's not good for man to be alone." Well, when we stop and think about this, if you know your creation account, what's really weird about this is that this happens pre-fall. God says this before the fall, right? The fall happens, Genesis 3. It's not good for man to be alone. What does this imply? That there are certain types of suffering like loneliness or hunger that exist as God-given drives, motivations that push us to a good outcome. If they're not satisfied, they will lead to pain. Pain on its own is a good boundary. Our uncomfortable emotions are good guides to us. So I'm going to give you a nice theology term here. We're exocentric beings. What this means is that we're created to find fulfillment outside of ourselves. We are created in the image of God, and God is this community, right? Trilogy, the trilogy, 3 in 1. Trilogy? Trinity. Not trilogy. I mean, it's kind of a trilogy. Trinity. You know what I mean. So there's 3. There's 3 in 1. It's this community within God. But and we're created in God's image. And so there's this aspect of us that must find its full self outside of ourselves, right? Later in Genesis 2, it says that man would leave his parents and unite with his wife, and they would become one flesh. So as humans, we go from our family of origin to our family of creation, from one community to another. And this idea that we have of the individual in our society is kind of a weird myth. Like, it's not real. Nobody can exist on their own. Even if you lived as a person in the wilderness, survival man in the bush, like, you still were birthed and nursed and raised for 18 years. Like, nobody can exist as an individual. So we're exocentric. And so you say, that's very nice, Cory, but what is this all about? What does this have to do with suffering? This drive of loneliness, that it's not good to be alone, is one type of suffering that existed before the fall. And this means that not all suffering is the result of sin, or as a state of brokenness, of shalom. So there's an aspect of suffering that exists even before the fall. There's longing. It's ultimately desire, right? God has created us to desire, to be driven towards completion outside of ourselves. And that can be uncomfortable and lead to great suffering. I think sometimes we have this weird Gnostic idea of shalom and life before the fall that assumes that there was no pain. But a painless life isn't shalom, that's comatose. If anything, that's closer to death. To live is to be embodied, which means this vulnerability, to be exocentric, and it also means these drives of desire that I don't think are bad. Like, did Adam and Eve not feel hunger? Did they not feel desire towards each other? Did they not feel pain? I think sometimes we kind of get that confused in our head. What this ultimately means, though, is that we are created with a core vulnerability, deeply vulnerable to loneliness and loss. If we're exocentric beings, if we find completion outside of ourselves, in unity and relationship, then when we lose what we love, we experience anguish. We experience this losing of our own completion. And so in some ways, we've been created in this way that we're permanently vulnerable. We're vulnerable if we are alone, and we're vulnerable if we love. Because, of course, grief is love. Grief is deeply connected to love. On top of this is a really weird thing if you think about it. Creation is designed to consume itself in order to stay alive. Every meal that you eat is a type of sacrifice, right? This is why it's so beautiful that Christ uses the imagery of the Last Supper. In the Last Supper, there's no way to live without something dying for you to consume it. My point here is that God created this world, creation, to be vulnerable and to be prone to death and rebirth. This cycle is baked into the system. It exists in nature all around us. And we're not separated from this reality. We are part of it. So, couldn't God build a world where we didn't have to suffer? Again, we come to some sense that either God is not totally powerful or he's not completely good. Somehow, somewhere along the lines, we think God screwed something up. Why would God make it so that suffering is part of life? There are some theories, but this is where Theodicy breaks down. When it comes to assuming God's intention, ultimately we don't know and we can't know. But for some reason, God created us this way, fundamentally vulnerable to pain, to be incomplete on our own, and to suffer. What is even more baffling, though, I find this a lot really interesting. What's more baffling than why do I suffer is why does God suffer? Why would God allow himself to suffer? The almighty creator of the universe didn't just build a creation that suffers, but he himself. He willingly took on flesh and suffered with us. Why did God create a suffering creation? And why is God a suffering God? I think is maybe an even harder question to answer. So Nicholas Walterstorff, he's a professor emeritus at Yale University in philosophical theology. If anyone could answer these questions of theodicy, it would be him. He's a professor at one of the most prestigious schools in the entire world who's devoted his life to philosophical theology. He lost his son, who was in his early 20s, in a mountain climbing accident. And in his grief, he wrote this book, Lament for a Son. It's about 100 pages, and it's brilliant, profound, devastating. He offers very little in terms of answers, but he gives some incredible insights. Most of all, what he does is he wrestles with God, like Steve was talking about last week. So this, in my opinion, this is the single best piece of theodicy that I've come across. I wanted to share a little bit of it today. They're kind of dense. It is. I might become a little emotional because I think the writing is really beautiful. So if I pause, just, I don't know, look at the words and ponder on them. So how is faith to endure, O God, when you allow this scraping and tearing on us? You have allowed rivers of blood to flow, mountains of suffering to pile up, sobs to become humanity's song, all without lifting a finger that we could see. You have allowed bonds of love beyond number to be painfully snapped. If you have not abandoned us, explain yourself. We strain to hear, but instead of hearing an answer, we catch sight of God himself scraped and torn. Through our tears, we see the tears of God. A new and more disturbing question now arises. Why do you permit yourself to suffer, O God? If the death of the devout costs you dear, why do you permit it? Why do you not grasp joy? For a long time, I knew that God is not the impassive, unresponsive, unchanging being portrayed in the classical theologians.
I knew of the pathos of God. I knew of God's response to delight, and of his response of displeasure. But strangely, his suffering I never saw before. God is not only the God of the sufferers, but the God who suffers. The pain and fallenness of humanity have entered into his heart. Through the prism of my tears, I have seen a suffering God. It is said of God that no one can behold his face and live. I always thought this meant that no one could see his splendor and live. A friend said perhaps it meant no one could see his sorrow and live, or perhaps his sorrow is his splendor. And great mystery, to redeem our brokenness and lovelessness, the God who suffers with us did not strike some mighty blow of power, but sent his beloved Son to suffer like us, through his suffering to redeem us from suffering and evil. Instead of explaining our suffering, God shares it. But I never saw it. Though I confess that the man of sorrows was God himself, I never saw the God of sorrows. Though I confess the man bleeding on the cross was the redeeming God, I never saw God himself on the cross. Blood from sword and thorn and nail dripping healing into the world's wounds. Ooh, that's good. What does this mean for life, that God suffers? I'm only beginning to learn. What we think of God, when we think of God the Creator, we naturally see the rich and powerful of the earth as his closest image. But when we hold steady before us the sight of God the Redeemer, redeeming from sin and suffering by suffering, then perhaps we must look elsewhere for earth's closest icon, where perhaps the face of that woman with soup tin in hand and bloated child at side. Perhaps that is why Jesus said that inasmuch as we show love to such a one, we show love to him. God is love. That is why he suffers. To love our suffering, sinful world is to suffer. God so suffered for the world that he gave up his only Son to suffering. The one who does not see God's suffering does not see his love. God is suffering love. So suffering is down at the meaning of things. Deep down where the meaning is, suffering is the meaning of our world. For love is the meaning, and love suffers. The tears of God are the meaning of history. But mystery remains. Why isn't love without suffering the meaning of things? Why is suffering love the meaning? Why does God endure his sufferings? Why does he not at once relieve his agony by relieving ours? That was a lot, so thanks for hanging in there. Why is suffering love the meaning of things? We don't know God's motivation, but for some reason he thought it best to create us in a way that is fundamentally vulnerable. Beyond this, God joins us in the suffering, and that is the mystery, and somehow suffering is a core piece of it. In Ezekiel 37, God brings Ezekiel to a valley of dry bones, and Ezekiel looks around at this place where death is all that can be seen. The only precedent here is death, decayed, dried out. And God asks Ezekiel, can these bones live? And Ezekiel's answer is that, oh God, you alone know. And God says, prophesy to the bones. Tell them I'll put my breath back into them, and that they will live again. And so in this place where there's only death and destruction for as far back as one can imagine, God still somehow brings new life. Somehow there is this theme through Scripture that current sufferings point to future glory, and that the work of God can be seen in the blind man, that my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness, and sometimes God protects and heals. Lazarus was raised from the dead, but only after Jesus wept. Sometimes God brings redemption long after we're devastated by sorrow. And sometimes we never know, like Job. But somehow suffering is part of this whole story. So today we come together to remember the power of resurrection in the face of death, to physically participate in the sacrament and memory of God's confusing willingness to participate in our own brokenness and suffering, where Word became flesh and dwelt among us, suffered and died as one of us, redeeming suffering through suffering. The table is open to all.